So just thank you for the Linux Recruit guys for giving us a slot. We've got 30 minutes, so I am going to ditch all my slideware and set my playback speed to 2 speed for everyone's enjoyment. So I'll just do a quick scene set. My name is Corcoran. I'm a solution architect with Slalom Consulting. Slalom, last couple of years, have been AWS's largest revenue generating partner. We are worldwide 8,000 plus employees, 36 offices, and we have loads of smart people, not me, other smart people, engineers, software developers, data scientists, DevOps folks, all working under the umbrella of Slalom Build, which is exactly like it sounds. So check out slalombuild.com for more info about that. So how did we get here? If I had $1 for every time someone said DevSecOps, I'd probably have $400 or $500 by now. Back in January, which historically is obviously the worst month of the year until 2020, when March and forever onwards has been the worst month of the year. I was sat in something called an office with some colleagues of mine, and we were arguing about testing Terraform with unit tests and integration tests. And to me, unit testing on unopinionated Terraform modules made very little sense because they are essentially quite static. And integration or other BDD testing in our pipelines all felt a bit like it was happening too late in the day. You know, a DevOps engineer had already written a module, the module's already in an integration layer, and everyone's too busy to notice that the S3 bucket permissions are set to public. So, right, bad. So we argued a lot in the office. I shouted shift left and DevSecOps, and people threw empty bottles of beer at me. And then I went on to DuckDuckGo, and I found this little tool sat there quietly in the wild called Chekhov from a company called Bridgecrew that no one's ever heard of. But it's some solid stuff. In January, when it was released, it was probably on a par with other Terraform and AWS static code scanning tools at the time, with 30 or so CIS benchmark type checks. And we, Slalom London, we worked with Bridgecrew quite a bit. We extended it to support Windows Desktop. Yeah, boo-hiss. We added checks for GCP and GitHub, and we nagged them about private repos for very specific checks that enterprises might want to keep to themselves. And as of today, right now, I guess it has over 300 checks for AWS, Azure, serverless, GCP, and GitHub. So I'm going to stop talking and let the product do the talking and hand you over to Barak.
All right. Thank you, Corcoran. Yeah, so it's been a crazy 6 or 7 months working together with Slalom teams and with other amazing teams that have contributed to this open source project named Chekhov. And in this talk, we'll talk about the motivation of why we chose to develop that tool, where we found it useful, and also of the journey that we went together on creating a better DevSecOps or static analysis tool for infrastructure code to make cloud manifest not a par with best practices. So the problem statement is how can we make quality, secure infrastructure code manifests? As Corcoran said, those can be serverless frameworks, Kubernetes manifest, Terraform, CloudFormation, and the list goes on. And the thing is that those best practices are widely known. The CIS benchmark is one of those where you know that you should have your stuff encrypted. PCI have similar best practices, HIPAA, and other compliance benchmarks will enforce you to have all of the encryption, IAM policies, logging and auditing features in place, and have backup and recovery on each and every resource that you spin out in the cloud, whether it is AWS or any other vendor. And how can we catch that very early on without being swamped with JIRA tickets that are happening by the security team and not the DevOps team right after the fact, after the resources have been provisioned? We really want to catch this issue while developing it on our laptop. And we want to share this knowledge of security with other engineers in our team. So we came out with this open source tool named Chekhov. Bridgecrew is a cloud security company that really believes in open source tools. We have Chekhov as a static analysis for infrastructure code, and some other cool projects that I invite you to check out in our GitHub repository, like RIM for least privileged IAM, some guidelines and education tools like TerraGoat that have a lot of material on our blog too. But on Chekhov specifically, we want really to build the best testing utility for infrastructure code. Because all of those infrastructure code modules that people are writing are coming from various repositories like AWS blogs, the Terraform registry, open source GitHub, Stack Overflow question, where you typically look in Google of, hey, how should I stand up an EC2 server? And you copy it from Stack Overflow or from the Terraform documentation, and you miss the default configuration of encryption of EBS volume that is turned off. Or you miss the logging and auditing or backups of snapshots. And what we wanted to do is, hey, you have all of those open source or internal repositories of Terraform modules, as an example. And what we want to do with them is to make sure that if we use them inside our own organization or copy paste them, we want to make sure that they are complied with those best practices. So we ask ourselves, after developing this tool, how secure is the open source world? If I'll take a random Terraform module from the wild, what's the chances that it's configured correctly by default? So we run Chekhov and the Bridgecrew platform on the entire world, a lot of Terraform modules with those opinionated checks. It is important to say that writing in Terraform does not imply that you write unsecure code. On the contrary, it gives you the ability to write and define secured code in a secured infrastructure in a centralized place. What we wanted to do is to ask ourselves, are all of those default configuration really secure by default? So as a trend, we ask ourselves, how many Terraform modules are there and what's their growth? And during COVID, there have been a lot of new Terraform modules contributed to the open source, which is great. We love open source. But the thing is, as long as you write more code, you have more bugs in it. So this is the percentage of misconfigs of those common best practices that you might find on those newly contributed modules. And it's kind of crazy because more and more modules are being contributed, more bugs are being contributed, more companies are provisioning more of those modules, and they had over 10 million downloads, 56% of the 26 million downloads of those Terraform modules that are misconfigured. Those are a lot of provisioned, misconfigured EC2 instances. And those misconfigurations are in various categories. For example, backup and recovery is not always turned on. And you can understand why, because it might cost you money. But you should, if you provision in production and you copy paste a code, you want it to have backup and recovery in place. Same for auditing. Kubernetes, which is pretty new to Terraform, is not always configured correctly. And it's also obvious because it has so many knobs and switches that it's really easy to miss the security policies to be configured in the right way. Networking is usually configured good, so not a lot of open ports to the entire world, which is great. And not a lot of admins found there in the wild. And part of the work that we did with Slalom is actually to monitor their own Terraform open source modules. And they had, at the time, 41 open source repositories with millions of downloads. And together, we succeeded to move the amount of misconfigs only to 2% around logging of a service that did not require logging. And this is an amazing progress that we've done together of changing those default configuration to make sure that all the right parameters are in place. So what is Chekhov? Chekhov is a policy as code open source tool. It is version controlled. You can peer review all of those policies that you're writing. Since it's written in Python, when writing a policy, you can use inheritance. You can automate it in your software development lifecycle as part of a CI integration. And you can streamline all of those errors much early on in your development lifecycle. So let's take a look and start with a short demo. So the Bridgecrew platform is backed by this open source framework named Chekhov. It's a SaaS solution that wraps it up and adds a bunch of additional capabilities. It's very easy to sign up. You just use your Google, GitHub, or work email, hit it, and then you'll go into this onboarding screen. Whoops, click the wrong one. Where you will be able to connect your AWS, Azure, or Google account, Kubernetes cluster, and also your source control via a standard application of those marketplaces. Right after taking those integrations and putting them in place, what you will be able to do is to understand if you have issues in your infrastructure as code. So over here, as an example, I have a file of a DB application that is being stand up in this Terraform file with the default encryption turned off. And what Bridgecrew and Chekhov suggest me to do is to turn it on. And I can choose this specific resource, hit remediate, and the Bridgecrew platform will actually open a pull request that will automatically fix my infrastructure as code. So if I'll go into the TerraGoat repository, what I can see now is that I have a new pull request that was created 18 seconds ago with this encryption now turned on, which means that I can now comply with those best practices when I'm writing this infrastructure as code. As Corcoran said, there is a list of 300 different policies across the cloud providers, Kubernetes, and infrastructure manifests that can be turned off or on, and some additional ones can be easily added. You can also integrate the Bridgecrew platform with your CI/CD pipeline and have it adding comments on each and every new code that you're writing, telling you, hey, you should really not have hard-coded access keys in your code as they exist here on my Terraform block. So how would you start? You can obviously use the SaaS platform if you want a very easy onboarding. But if you want to build it in your own hands and use the open source light version of it, you can look for Chekhov. It's under Apache 2 license. It's bridgecrew.io/Chekhov at GitHub or www.chekhov.io. And the installation is pretty simple. You can use pip install Chekhov or brew, or use a Docker container to pull the latest Chekhov release. And let's take a look on how it looks like. So let's say that I've already installed Chekhov on my laptop. I have it here. When looking on the help, what I can see is that the basic parameter that it needs is a directory. Means Chekhov will require a directory to scan where you have your infrastructure as code in place. So from directory perspective, I have here two directories of two different infrastructure folders, AWS and Azure. And inside the AWS directory, I have EC2 instances, Elasticsearch, S3 buckets, and the list go on. What I'm going to try to do is take a look on how my S3 Terraform is configured. And I've written here in comments, but if I'll ignore those, I can see that I have a public read S3 bucket, and it lacks the configuration of encryption, versioning, logging, and auditing. So basically nothing good is in place here. If someone wants the data inside this bucket, they will get it. And another example is, let's take a look on my EC2 instances that I've defined in code. I don't know, it's like a big blob of code. To go over it will take me time. I want to catch it very early on while developing and know that I have an issue. So what I can do is write Chekhov minus directory, or just -d as a short. Choose the AWS directory and ask Chekhov to scan all of my Terraform code. And it's the same command for any kind of manifest that you're having. So what Chekhov will do is it will create a CLI report where you can see all of your passing checks, the good things that you've done while writing this code. So we have here a data bucket that does not have a public write access, and that's good. A financials bucket that is also not public. That's another good job that I've done. So I'm probably doing a pretty good job as an engineer of Terraform. But here, after going over this list, here comes the bad things that I've done as an engineer, and I should really get better at this. Here I have this bucket without S3 encryption turned on, and that's the lines that are violating it. Those are the lines of this resource. And over here, I have a link to a guideline that explains to me you don't need to log in order to see those guidelines. That explains to me as an engineer the rationale behind encrypting an S3 bucket. I want to encrypt it because I don't want other users to have access to it. But if there is a user within my AWS account, the encryption is being transparent. So I have all of those misconfigs, among them also the plain text access keys that I had in my code, detected the unencrypted database that we've shown that the platform can remediate. And the list goes on and on. So how can I automatically detect those issues while developing? So Chekhov, if you go to www.chekhov.io, and after going through the installation phase, you'll take a look on a pre-commit hook configuration. You can actually configure a pre-commit hook on your workstation that will prevent you from committing new code that contains bad practices. Which means if you write Terraform code, you cannot push code that has bad practices in. But what if there is some kinds of acceptable risks? What if this bucket should actually be public because it contains website assets? What you can do is if you go into the suppressions tab, is the exact same example that is public and contains a static content. I want it to be publicly accessible. So you can have just a very similar annotation to a JUnit or Python test annotation, telling to Chekhov as the testing framework be public. Going back to how to manage Chekhov at scale, what you can do after scanning your directory and configuring a pre-commit hook, what you can do is to configure the same utility in your CI/CD pipeline. And this will look like this. Let's say a developer is pushing a change. The developer will get the code scanned for security best practices together with the unit tests. And if the unit test of security means checkout passes successfully, you can safely apply all of your resources into your production account. Obviously, if you want it to be out of the box, you can use the SaaS, but the open source allows you to do